The Forest of Death. There was a place that no one dared to speak of, not in hushed whispers, nor in boastful tales. The locals called it the Forest of Death, and for good reason. It was a place shrouded in mystery, a patch of land that had swallowed the hopes and lives of many. The forest stretched for miles, its dense foliage so thick that even sunlight found it hard to pierce the canopy. It lay just beyond the small, quiet town of Hilford, a place most people passed through on their way to somewhere else, until the rumors began to spread. The first signs of something unnatural had appeared decades ago, when an expedition led by a group of scientists entered the forest in search of rare plants and animals. None of them returned. Since then, several others had ventured in, all with the same grim outcome. The forest, it seemed, was alive in ways that no one could fully understand. Tom Harris was different from the others. He wasn't just another thrill seeker or fool looking for a cheap scare. Tom was driven by something far more personal. His sister, Lily, had vanished into the forest 5 years ago. She had been last seen walking toward the woods after receiving a strange letter, one that spoke of a secret hidden within its depths. Desperate to find answers, Tom had spent every waking moment obsessing over the forest. He had studied the accounts of those who had disappeared, and he had heard the tales, dark and twisted, that told of a presence in the woods, something ancient, something malevolent. He stood at the edge of the forest now, the cold wind tugging at his jacket, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the trees. The townspeople had warned him, told him that the forest had claimed too many lives already. But Tom was undeterred. He had made a promise to Lily, and he would keep it. If she was out there, lost or trapped, he would find her. And if not, he would uncover the truth behind the horror that lay within. With a final glance back at the town, Tom stepped into the shadows of the trees. The air grew thick with an unnatural stillness, and the silence was almost deafening. Not a bird chirped, not a leaf rustled. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The deeper he ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in on him, their twisted branches like skeletal arms reaching out to grab him. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, and every now and then he thought he heard whispers, low, indecipherable murmurs that sent a shiver down his spine. Hours passed, and Tom's hope began to waver. He had seen nothing, heard nothing, save for the eerie silence that weighed heavily on his chest. But then, just as he was beginning to consider turning back, he saw it, a figure standing in the distance, barely visible through the fog. His heart raced. Could it be Lily? He approached cautiously, every muscle tensed. The figure didn't move, didn't react to his presence. As he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. The figure was not Lily. It was a man, or what was left of one. The body was slumped against a tree, its face twisted in a grotesque expression of horror. His skin had been drained of color, his eyes wide open, staring into the void. His clothes were tattered, as if they had been torn apart by something with immense strength. But the most disturbing thing of all was the mark on his neck. 2 deep puncture wounds, as if something had fed on him. Tom recoiled, his stomach turning. He had heard the stories, of course, the tales of creatures that roamed the forest, of something that preyed on those who wandered too deep. But he had never believed them. Now, standing before this horrific sight, he wasn't so sure. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden rustling in the underbrush behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but there was nothing there. Only the thick trees and the oppressive silence. "Who's there?" Tom called out, his voice trembling despite his attempt at bravado. No answer, only the eerie quiet of the forest. The tension in the air grew unbearable, and Tom's instincts screamed at him to run. But he couldn't. Not yet. He had to keep going. Lily could still be out there. With his nerves on edge, Tom pressed forward, determined to find answers. The further he went, the more the forest seemed to warp around him. The trees twisted in unnatural angles, their bark blackened as if scorched by fire. The path became less distinct, and he found himself stumbling over roots and rocks. Suddenly, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he whirled around, But again, there was nothing. Only the cold, empty forest. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself. Something was following him. But what? As night began to fall, the temperature dropped, and an unnatural fog rolled in, obscuring his vision. The forest seemed to be alive with whispers now, voices that seemed to come from all around him. Some were soft, others loud, but they all carried the same message: leave. But Tom refused to turn back. The forest was far from just a place of evil. It was a place of secrets, secrets buried beneath the earth, hidden for centuries. Tom was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. The deeper Tom ventured, the more the forest began to feel like it was swallowing him whole. The fog thickened around him, clinging to his clothes and skin, making it hard to breathe. It was as though the very air itself was saturated with something ancient and malicious, something that had been lurking for centuries. His heart hammered in his chest as he tried to push forward, but with every step, the trees seemed to shift, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque, claw-like hands that reached down toward him. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence, sending a wave of cold terror down Tom's spine. The scream was distorted, like the voice of a person in agony, but it wasn't human. It echoed through the forest, reverberating off the trees, and then silence. Tom froze, his breath caught in his throat. He looked around, his eyes darting wildly, but he saw nothing but darkness and twisted shapes. The whispering voices that had been murmuring in the distance earlier were now louder, more insistent, as if the forest itself was beckoning him to join in the madness. "Lily," Tom whispered under his breath, trying to call out to her, though he knew deep down that whatever was out there was not his sister. It was something else, something much darker. His footsteps quickened, driven by a mix of fear and determination. He needed to find her. The pain of her disappearance had gnawed at him for years, and now, in the face of these unspeakable horrors, he couldn't stop. But the forest had no intention of letting him leave easily. Tom's vision blurred as the fog grew thicker, wrapping itself around his face like a suffocating blanket. The world around him seemed to distort, the trees bending at unnatural angles. It was as though the forest was alive, its roots pulsing like a beating heart beneath the ground. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move. A figure, tall and thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was a blank, pale canvas, its eyes sunken and hollow, devoid of any human emotion. Tom's body froze in place, his feet glued to the ground by an invisible force. The figure moved closer, its footsteps silent but heavy, as if it were gliding rather than walking. It stopped just inches from him, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The air grew colder, and Tom's breath came out in sharp, visible puffs. His heart thundered in his chest as he stared into the empty face of the creature. The thing cocked its head to the side, as if studying him, before opening its mouth in a grin that stretched far too wide, too unnatural. A voice, cold and hollow, whispered through the fog. "You should have stayed away, Tom Harris. You've walked into our domain. There is no escape." The words sent a wave of dread crashing over him, but before he could react, the creature reached out with its bony hand and touched his shoulder. The moment it made contact, a searing pain shot through Tom's body, like 1,000 needles piercing his skin. His vision went white, and he fell to his knees, gasping for breath. Suddenly, the pain ceased, and Tom found himself in a different place. He was no longer in the forest. He was standing in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by hundreds of trees that were alive with movement. But these were not trees. They were twisted, dark figures, their bark-like skin crawling with worms and insects. They had faces, screaming, contorted faces that stared at him with hollow eyes. The air reeked of decay and rot, and the ground was slick with something viscous and foul. In the center of the clearing was a massive, ancient tree, its roots gnarled and twisted like the arms of a corpse. From its branches hung dozens of bodies, all of them lifeless, their eyes wide open in terror. They were suspended by thick vines that seemed to be alive, writhing like serpents as they held the bodies in place. Tom's stomach churned as he recognized one of the faces. It was Lily, but she was different. Her once bright eyes were now empty and cold, and her skin had turned a sickly gray, as if life had been drained from her. Her body hung limply, swaying gently in the breeze, as if she were nothing more than a puppet. "No," Tom whispered, his heart breaking as he took a step forward. But the ground beneath him cracked open, revealing a chasm that seemed to lead down into an abyss. Dark shapes shifted and moved at the edge of his vision, and he could hear the sound of something breathing, slow, deep breaths, like the inhale of some enormous, slumbering beast. Suddenly, the forest came alive around him. The trees creaked and groaned as if they were stretching, their branches reaching down to grab him. The ground began to tremble, and the sky above darkened, turning a deep, unsettling red. The creatures that had been watching him from the shadows now began to emerge in full form. Grotesque figures with pale, twisted faces, their limbs unnaturally long and their mouths stretched into jagged, toothy grins. They closed in on him from all sides, and Tom's legs gave way beneath him. He fell to the ground, his body weak and trembling with fear. He could hear their voices now, low and guttural, speaking in a language that made his blood run cold. One of the creatures crouched down beside him, its face inches from his. Its breath was hot and foul, and as it spoke, Tom felt his very soul being torn apart. "You should have never come here, Tom Harris. You have awoken something older than time. The forest is hungry, and now it will feast on your fear." Before he could respond, the creature let out a bone-chilling laugh and disappeared into the darkness. The others followed suit, their haunting laughter echoing through the forest like the cries of a damned. Tom was left alone in the clearing, surrounded by the twisted, writhing trees and the lifeless bodies of the lost souls who had come before him. The truth was clear now. There was no escape. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him. As the darkness closed in around him, Tom felt the cold fingers of despair tighten around his throat. He had come to find his sister, but now he understood. The forest wasn't a place of life. It was a place of death, a place where souls were devoured, never to return. And soon, he would join them. Tom could still not shake off the horrific scene he had just witnessed. The images of Lily, hanging limply amidst the decay of the forest, haunted him relentlessly. But there was something strange within the oppressive stillness of that horrifying moment. Tom could feel the presence of something, not a human, but an invisible force, constantly watching him. He tried to stand, his hands trembling as they pressed against the ground to regain his balance. The pain had not completely left his body, as though an invisible force had crushed him. His palms were soaked with sweat, and he could feel an unexplainable coldness invading his body. Suddenly, he heard footsteps, soft, yet loud enough to echo in the deathly silence of the forest. When he turned, all he saw was thick fog and indistinct shapes flickering in the mist. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. He couldn't stand still, but each time he tried to run, his body felt as though it was being held back by an invisible force, as though something was grabbing onto his legs, preventing him from leaving. As he stepped past a dense bush, his eyes froze when he saw a large shadow moving in the darkness. It was a strange figure, not human. A towering creature with skin wrinkled like that of a decayed corpse. Its eyes glowed red, and in those eyes, there was something horrifying, an insatiable hunger. Tom tried to scream, but his throat tightened. A strange sound echoed deep within the creature's throat, like the rustling of bones. Since ancient times, folk tales have often spoken of a terrifying creature, born from nightmares, dwelling in the shadows that surround us. It is not a common monster, but rather the embodiment of death, of what is forgotten, of dark memories that humanity dares not face. The name the villagers gave it is the Deadly Shadow. Whenever it appears, the worst of fates will follow. The story begins in a small village hidden quietly between vast, dense forests, where darkness always falls early each night. This village, called Tuilin, is a humble settlement with houses made of bamboo and thatched roofs, surrounded by towering hills and trees. The lives of the villagers are peaceful until a series of strange events begin to unfold. One stormy night, when a fierce thunderstorm raged outside, a stranger arrived at the village. A tall man, cloaked in black, covering himself from head to toe. He walked silently, as though unaware of everything around him. No one in the village knew who he was, but their anxious gazes followed every step of this mysterious guest. After the stranger's arrival, strange occurrences began to spiral out of control. First, the chickens died, then the dogs, cats, and even the cows all found lifeless with their eyes wide open, their mouths drenched in blood, but with no visible wounds. As if that wasn't enough, on moonlit nights, when everyone in the village was deep in slumber, footsteps could be heard softly but ominously on the streets. Dark figures, indistinct and shadowy, seemed to pass in front of every house. These were signs of the appearance of the deadly shadow. The darkness was no longer a mere concept. It had become something tangible, something that could be felt. It wasn't just the absence of light, but the presence of an entity that carried death with it. And the stranger, whom the villagers had dubbed the Invisible One, was believed to be the one who summoned this darkness. The mysterious events started escalating when those who had survived each night fell gravely ill. They developed high fevers, gasped for breath, their eyes rolled back, and while they couldn't explain it, they all shared one nightmare. A dark shadow, shapeless and formless, standing silently, watching them. And each time this shadow appeared, a villager would die. Fear spread like wildfire through the village. Families stayed indoors at night, and even the wise elders and shamans couldn't uncover the truth behind these bizarre occurrences. They said that the deadly shadow was a curse awakened by an ancient force, and that the stranger, the Invisible One, was the only person capable of controlling its arrival. The shadow's presence took root deeply in the minds of the villagers. No one dared venture out after dark, and when a group of young men set out to find the stranger, they never returned. Those who remained said they had seen dark figures moving in the night, passing by them like ghostly shadows. Then, they too vanished into the silent night. One day, a young girl named Mai, the daughter of the village chief, decided that she would no longer live in fear. She was determined to uncover the truth about the deadly shadow and the darkness that had haunted her village for months. She began her journey on a moonless night. After the storm had passed, Mai walked into the dense forest, the place where the villagers claimed the shadow had first appeared. Her footsteps were soft, but the weight of her anxiety didn't lift. The air was thick, heavy with the damp smell of wet earth. The trees towered high above her, their branches twisted into the night sky, casting eerie shadows all around. The night in the forest was always still, but tonight, that stillness was filled with dread. As she ventured deeper into the woods, every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of insects, seemed amplified, echoing through the silence. I suddenly heard footsteps behind her. She turned around, but there was no one there. Her heart raced, but she didn't stop. She had to keep going. I had heard stories from her grandmother about monsters that haunted the woods. Her grandmother once said that anyone who ventured into this forest on a dark night would never return. The evil ones or the cursed ones would be taken by the deadly shadow and never seen again. But I didn't believe in superstitions. She thought only the truth could dispel the doubts and fears that had gripped her. After walking for a while, she stopped when she reached a clearing where a crystal-clear lake lay. By the shore stood an ancient tree, its thick trunk towering above her. This was the place her grandmother had spoken of, the place where darkness and death were intertwined. She sat down by the water, resting her hand on its cool surface. It was as though time had paused. Everything around her seemed to freeze in a moment of tense anticipation. She could feel a strange pull, as though someone or something was watching her from within the shadows. An overwhelming sense of fear washed over her. Suddenly, movement caught her eye. Shadows began to shift around the lake, and a cold gust of wind brushed against her skin. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light anymore. It was alive, a presence that seemed to breathe. I spun around, her eyes locking onto a dark figure standing just a few feet away. It was not human, nor any creature she had ever seen before. It was a massive, shadowy form with no distinct shape. The only thing visible were its glowing red eyes, like pools of blood, staring straight at her. I stood frozen, her heart pounding. She could not move, yet she could not turn away. The shadow's red eyes never left hers. The darkness around her deepened, as if it were drawing her in. Step by step, the shadow moved toward her, its presence like a crushing weight. I could not think, could not react. But then she remembered the words of her grandmother. When you face the deadly shadow, calm your mind and do not let fear rule you. I took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady her nerves. She could not let fear control her. The shadow stopped in front of her. Its red eyes still burned into her. But now, for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty within them. A strange feeling filled her. This shadow wasn't purely evil, but rather a being trapped in its own suffering and destruction. You've come to destroy me, haven't you? The voice that came from the shadow was not a human voice, but a chilling echo, like wind whistling through narrow cracks. I stood tall and spoke with determination. I've come to understand you. The shadow was silent for a moment, then asked, do you truly want to know? Do you really wish to end this curse? I nodded, her voice unwavering. I've come to end the fear that haunts us all. The shadow remained still, then smiled, a cold, haunting smile. Then you must pay the price. I stepped forward, her heart filled with both fear and resolve. She knew she could not confront this darkness with force or violence. She had to face it with love, understanding, and courage. She reached out and placed her hand gently on the water's surface, feeling the connection to the earth, the trees, and the souls of those lost. She whispered a prayer her grandmother had taught her, a prayer for peace and release. May the light banish the shadow. May the trapped souls be freed. A brilliant light suddenly erupted from the center of the forest, breaking through the thick darkness. The shadow recoiled. Its form began to blur, and the red eyes dimmed. In the midst of the night, the light cut through, illuminating everything around them. I felt a deep sense of calm, knowing the battle was over. The shadow finally faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. The forest returned to stillness, but this time it was peaceful, not ominous. I knew her journey was complete. I walked back to Tuilin village, no longer afraid. The village still slept, unaware that the darkness they had feared for so long had been dispelled. But I understood that within every villager, the light remained. The next day, when the sun rose, I shared her story with the villagers. She didn't speak of the miraculous things she had witnessed, but rather told them that darkness only becomes powerful when we allow it to dwell in our hearts. She taught them that fear is just a shadow, and only when we face it with courage can the light truly return. The villagers no longer feared the dark. The animals, the chickens, the dogs, and the cattle were healthy again. Life returned to normal, but something had changed within the people. They no longer lived in fear, and they now understood that love, courage, and hope were the true forces that could defeat any darkness. Mai became a hero in the village's heart, but she only smiled, remembering that she was just an ordinary person who dared to face fear and seek peace for herself and others. The Evil in the Mirror. Chapter 1. The Mirror's Gaze. It was a rainy night when Eliza first encountered the mirror. She had just moved into the old, dilapidated house on the outskirts of the village. The house had always been a subject of gossip, but she was a practical woman, not one to be swayed by superstitions or the ramblings of her neighbors. However, that night, something felt different. Eliza's family had purchased the house cheaply, and she was eager to restore it to its former glory. As she explored the rooms, she came across a grand, antique mirror in the attic. It was framed with dark, intricate carvings that seemed to twist, and writhe as if alive. The glass was cloudy, with an eerie sheen, and it sent a chill down her spine. Her curiosity got the better of her. She wiped the glass clean, and as she gazed into it, she saw not her own reflection, but the faint outline of something else, something dark and shadowy lurking behind her. She turned, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at the mirror, the image was gone. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, she continued to inspect the rest of the house. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the dark figure in the mirror again, its hollow eyes staring back at her. She convinced herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew there was something more to the mirror than met the eye. Chapter 2. The haunting begins. Over the next few days, Eliza became obsessed with the mirror. She couldn't help but visit it every chance she got, hoping for answers. The more she stared into it, the more the figure began to take shape. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had a face, twisted, grotesque, with features that seemed to shift and change every time she looked away. But no matter how hard she tried, she could never make out the full details. There was always a haze, a distortion in the reflection. One evening, as Eliza stood before the mirror, she reached out a trembling hand to touch the surface. The moment her fingers brushed the glass, she felt a cold, unnatural chill that ran through her entire body. It was as though the mirror was alive, pulling her in. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror began to move on its own. The dark figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Eliza froze, unable to look away. It whispered her name, a voice low and gravelly, filled with an ancient, unearthly power. Eliza, her heart raced. She jerked her hand back, but the voice continued, growing louder and more insistent. Eliza, you belong to me now. The room seemed to spin, and before she could react, Eliza was pulled forward, her face pressed against the cold glass. For a split second, she saw the world behind her blur and fade away. Then, everything went black. Chapter 3, The Entity Revealed. When Eliza woke, she was no longer in the attic. She found herself in a place of darkness, a cold and oppressive void. The air was thick, suffocating, and the faintest whisper of her name echoed around her. Panic surged through her. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, a figure materialized before her, the same twisted shape from the mirror. But now it was fully formed, towering over her, its face contorted in an eternal snarl. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a demon, ancient and malevolent, a creature of pure darkness. I'm the one who resides in the mirror, it growled, its voice filling her mind. I'm the one who has been waiting for a soul to claim. Eliza stumbled backward, her heart pounding. She recognized the entity now, but it was too late. The demon reached out with long, clawed fingers, and Eliza felt herself drawn toward it, as though an invisible force was pulling her into its embrace. You should not have touched the mirror, the demon hissed. Now you are mine. Chapter 4, The Struggle for Her Soul. Eliza fought with every ounce of strength she had. She struggled to break free from the demon's grasp, but it was like trying to fight against the very fabric of the universe. Her mind raced as she searched for a way out, but the demon's power was too strong. You cannot escape me, it snarled. I'm the one who has been trapped here for centuries. The mirror is my prison, but it is also my gateway. And now, I have found a way to escape. The demon's form shifted, and Eliza saw glimpses of other souls trapped within it, their faces contorted in agony. She realized, then, that the mirror was not just a reflection. It was a portal, a gateway to the dark realm where the demon ruled. You will join them, the demon growled, its voice filled with triumph. But Eliza, despite her fear, refused to give in. She had to find a way out. There had to be some weakness in the demon's power. In a final desperate act, she recalled a phrase her grandmother had once told her when she was a child, a warning passed down through generations. To break the curse of the mirror, you must not look back. With all her willpower, Eliza forced herself to turn away from the demon, ignoring its taunts and pleas. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, focusing on the memory of her family, her life before the house, before the mirror. She concentrated on the warmth of the sunlight, the sound of birds singing, and the feeling of safety. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the attic, standing before the mirror. But the demon was gone. The mirror was once again just a reflection of herself, her trembling face staring back at her. Chapter 5, The Aftermath. Eliza thought she was free. The demon was gone, and the mirror no longer held the same ominous power. But as days passed, she realized something was wrong. The house felt emptier than before, and the whispers in the dark grew louder. The mirror, though silent, still seemed to watch her, its reflection no longer just a mirror of reality. One night, as she sat alone in the living room, she glanced at the mirror. This time, there was no figure, no shadow, just her reflection, but something was off. Her eyes, though looking back at her, seemed distant, hollow, as though the person in the mirror wasn't her at all. And then, the voice came again, soft and insidious. Eliza, the mirror had not been defeated. The demon was still there, still waiting. And it was only a matter of time before it would return. Chapter 6, The Unseen Forces. Eliza thought the worst was behind her, but the nightmare was far from over. Every night, she would wake up in a cold sweat, the echoes of the demon's voice still ringing in her ears. She had managed to free herself, or so she believed, but something was wrong with the house. It wasn't just the oppressive atmosphere. It was as if the very walls were closing in on her. The house creaked and groaned at night, and the air was thick with an eerie presence. One night, while she was in the kitchen, preparing a late dinner, she heard the faint sound of footsteps above her. She froze, her knife suspended in midair. It wasn't the house settling. It was the distinct sound of someone walking, slow, deliberate steps, dragging across the floorboards. Eliza's heart raced. She had been alone in the house for days. Who could it be? With a sense of dread, she grabbed a candle and ascended the stairs to the attic. The steps seemed unnaturally cold beneath her feet, and as she reached the door to the attic, she hesitated. Something was wrong. She could feel it deep within her bones. Slowly, she turned the handle and stepped inside. There, in the dim light, the mirror stood, reflecting not just her own image, but something else, a twisted version of herself. The reflection in the mirror was smiling, but it wasn't her smile. It was cruel, mocking, a grin that stretched impossibly wide, showing sharp, jagged teeth. The air grew colder, and the whispers began again, louder this time. Eliza, Eliza. She backed away from the mirror, but the reflection of herself in the glass did not move. It stayed frozen, staring at her with those sinister eyes, as though mocking her fear. Suddenly, her own reflection in the mirror began to move independently. Her reflection reached out of the glass, its hand extending toward her as if trying to grab her. Eliza screamed and stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The moment her back hit the ground, the house seemed to shift. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air grew heavy, as though she were trapped in a suffocating void. The temperature dropped dramatically, and frost began to form on the walls. She scrambled to her feet, but the mirror seemed to draw her in. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It had become a gateway to something far darker, far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 7, The Thing in the Mirror. The nightmare escalated when Eliza started to see strange things in her reflection that weren't in the room with her. She would stand before the mirror, brushing her hair or doing mundane tasks, only for her reflection to shift into something entirely different. Shadows would move behind her, whispering her name, their voices deep and guttural, like they were being spoken from the depths of a grave. One night, while Eliza was lying in bed, she heard a knock at the door. She got up, expecting it to be a neighbor, but when she opened it, no one was there. Her heart pounded as she stepped outside into the darkness. There was nothing but the sound of the wind, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. She closed the door quickly, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. But when she turned around, she saw it, the reflection of her own face in the hallway mirror. But this time, her reflection wasn't her own. It was distorted, like a grotesque parody of herself. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her mouth was stretched into a silent scream. She turned toward the mirror, but it was too late. The reflection in the glass began to distort even further, melting and contorting into a horrible, unnatural shape. The air grew thick with a presence that seemed to surround her, suffocating her. Eliza could feel it watching her from behind the mirror. The darkness in the glass seemed to shift, and in the shadows, she could make out the faint outline of something moving. Something with glowing red eyes, something that was not human. As she backed away, the voice came again, this time not from the mirror, but from the very air around her. Eliza, come closer. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. It was as if the air itself was choking her, filling her lungs with a cold, suffocating presence. The temperature in the room dropped so quickly that her breath came out in visible puffs. Her heart raced as she ran toward the door, but it slammed shut in her face, as if an invisible hand was holding it closed. Panic surged within her as she realized she was trapped. Then, the floorboards began to creak, and the walls seemed to close in. The mirror began to glow with an unnatural light, and from its depths, something began to emerge. A hand, black as the void, reached through the mirror. It was followed by another, and then a figure, tall, skeletal, and covered in shadow. It stepped out of the mirror, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face was hidden in darkness, but Eliza could feel its eyes upon her, piercing through the void. "You cannot escape me," it whispered. "You never could." Chapter 8, The Horrible Truth. In her panic, Eliza realized that the mirror wasn't just a portal, it was a prison. And the entity trapped inside, it was not merely a demon, but something far worse, something ancient that had been sealed away for centuries. The curse of a mirror was a bond, a pact made long ago, binding the souls of the living to the entity within. The creature stepped forward, its form now fully visible. It was no longer human, but a twisted, grotesque version of something that had once been alive. Its skin was gray and decayed, hanging from its bones like loose, rotting flesh. Its eyes glowed with an unholy red light, and its mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "Eliza, you are mine now," it hissed. "You will join the others. Your soul will be trapped here, just like the others before you." The room seemed to close in around her, and the shadows danced on the walls, whispering her name. Eliza tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature's claws reached for her, its fingers cold and unfeeling. In a desperate attempt to save herself, Eliza remembered the warning her grandmother had told her. To break the curse of the mirror, you must not look back. With trembling hands, she turned away from the creature, refusing to face it any longer. She ran, not looking back, even as the sound of the creature's footsteps echoed behind her, growing louder and louder with each passing moment. The house seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of corridors and rooms. Eliza could hear the whispers, feel the air growing colder with each step she took. The walls seemed to shift, warping and changing. She was no longer sure where she was or if she was even in the same house anymore. All she could do was run, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, she came to a stop. Before her stood the mirror again. It was as though it had been waiting for her, its surface gleaming in the dim light. But this time, the reflection in the glass wasn't hers. It was the creature standing in the mirror, its red eyes staring back at her with malevolent hunger. "Eliza," it whispered, its voice a low growl. Chapter 9, The Final Choice. Eliza knew she was at the end. The mirror had become a prison, a trap, and the only way out was to face the creature inside. But she had to make a choice. She could try to fight back, to shatter the mirror and destroy the demon once and for all, or she could succumb to the darkness, joining the countless souls trapped within the glass. As she gazed in the mirror one final time, she felt the weight of her decision. The creature's eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, it smiled. But Eliza knew she couldn't escape. The mirror had claimed her long ago, and now she was its prisoner forever. With one final, desperate scream, she reached for the mirror's surface, knowing that this would be her last act. The glass cracked, and the darkness consumed her whole. And the mirror, once again, returned to silence. Chapter 10, The Unraveling. Eliza felt her skin crawling as she touched the cracked surface of the mirror. The darkness behind the glass seemed to pulse, as if alive, and she could hear the faint sound of whispers, growing louder, more insistent. The creature's voice called to her again, its low growl reverberating deep within her mind. Eliza, you cannot escape. You are mine. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the voice, the growing sense of dread that surrounded her. But when she opened them again, the house around her had disappeared. She was no longer standing in the attic, but in a place that was neither dark nor light, a twisted, empty void. The reflection in the mirror was not just her own face anymore. It was a horrible, distorted version of her, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth twisted into a mocking grin. The figure in the mirror moved, its lips parting to speak. You never understood, did you? The figure in the mirror whispered. This house, this mirror, they were never meant to be your escape. You're a part of me now. You always have been. Eliza recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to step back, but her body refused to move. She was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare of her own making. From the mirror, something began to reach out. It was not the hand of the creature, but the hands of many souls, their twisted, decayed forms clawing through the glass, trying to drag her in. Eliza screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the emptiness around her. The hands reached further, their fingers long and sharp like talons. She tried to tear herself away, but the hands were too strong. They gripped her arms, pulling her toward the mirror. The darkness behind it seemed to swallow everything, growing deeper and more suffocating by the second. Her skin was cold, her body growing numb as the souls in the mirror pulled her closer, their hollow eyes staring at her with despair. Eliza, the voice croaked. You belong here now. You belong to me. Chapter 11, The Final Descent. In the struggle to escape, Eliza's thoughts raced. There had to be a way out. She remembered her grandmother's warning again. To break the curse of the mirror, you must not look back. But now it was too late. She had already broken that rule. The mirror had taken hold of her, and she was being consumed by its darkness. The ground beneath her feet began to dissolve, turning into mist. The very walls around her seemed to vanish, leaving only an endless black void. The souls of the trapped began to reach for her, their hollow eyes begging for release. As their fingers brushed against her skin, Eliza felt the cold, rotting touch of death, like ice crawling through her veins. She screamed again, this time feeling the weight of every soul in the mirror pulling her down into the darkness. Her body was sinking into the glass, her limbs locked in place, her breath quickening. And then something changed. The mirror itself began to pulse, its surface shifting as if it were breathing. The creature inside it, the demon, was no longer just a shadow. It was coming closer, its red eyes glowing brighter, filling her vision. Eliza could hear it laughing now, its voice like the sound of nails scraping across metal. Eliza, it whispered, its breath hot against her ear. You are the key. You always have been. Eliza realized then, the mirror had not just trapped her. It had always been waiting for someone to unlock it, someone to release the demon and the countless souls within. She was not just a victim of fate. She was a part of the curse, a part of the trap. With a final, desperate attempt to free herself, Eliza reached deep inside herself, summoning the last bit of strength she had left. She thought of her family, of the life she once had, and in that moment of clarity, she knew what she had to do. Chapter 12, The Final Choice. The mirror began to crack, the glass splintering as Eliza reached out with trembling hands, pushing against the cold surface. The demon's voice grew louder, its anger palpable. It thrashed within the mirror, trying to break free. "Eliza," it howled, "you cannot destroy me." But Eliza's will was stronger now. She pushed harder, the cracks spreading across the mirror like lightning, the glass splintering with a deafening crash. The darkness began to recede, but the demon's laughter filled the air, growing louder and louder. Then, in a flash of light, everything stopped. Epilogue: the mirror's return. When Eliza opened her eyes, she was back in the attic, standing before the shattered remains of the mirror. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. The air was still and cold, and there was no sign of the demon, no trace of the horror she had just experienced. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that it was over, that she had won. The house was silent, and the oppressive weight that had hung over her seemed to lift. She looked down at her hands, still trembling, and wiped the cold sweat from her brow. But then, something caught her eye, a glimmer of light. Eliza turned toward the remnants of the mirror, and in the shards of broken glass, she saw it. The reflection, her own face, but not quite. The eyes staring back at her were hollow, dark, and filled with a malevolent hunger. The corners of her mouth curled up into a wicked smile, a smile that wasn't hers. The demon was not gone. It had never left, and the mirror, though shattered, was still a part of her. As Eliza backed away in terror, she could hear the whispers again, low and haunting, coming from all around her. "Eliza, you cannot escape. You are mine." The mirror had returned.